Today we're going to be looking at First Timothy chapter 6, and we're not going to be looking at the entire chapter, neither are we going to be looking at just the first part of it. We're going to look at a few different sections of chapter 6 that touch on similar ideas. So we'll be jumping around a little bit, but we are going to start right away with verse 1. Paul writes in the beginning of chapter 6 what today is regarded, or would be regarded, as scandalous. He says that slaves should honor their masters and work hard. So he writes, all who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Those who have believing masters should not show them disrespect just because they're fellow believers. Instead, they should serve them even better because their masters are dear to them as fellow believers and are devoted to the welfare of their slaves. These are the things you're to teach and insist on. So, today this command would be seen as deeply racist in the context of American slavery, and in general it would be seen as favoring the rich and powerful over the weak and the oppressed, which is the cardinal sin of our culture at the moment. The book Uncle Tom's Cabin, back in the 1800s, portrayed the horrors of American slavery, but at the same time it portrayed Uncle Tom as this deeply devout Christian man who was living out his faith as a slave. Uncle Tom in the story was meant as an exemplar of Christian character, a person whose footsteps we should all follow in. So is it any wonder then, given that today Uncle Tom has been corrupted into an insult? In Uncle Tom's Cabin, we see what it really means to love one's enemies and the great cost it can incur. So we live in this non-Christian culture that has been deeply influenced by the legacy of Christianity. So our culture has all these ideas of Christianity just laying around, but they don't understand them. So it's taken Jesus' teaching about how we should love our enemies and pray for them, and it has let it devolve into this idea of that everyone is good. So if somebody's acting bad, and if you're nice to them, it will make them good. The culture teaches this as religion, and it starts teaching them when they're the people when they're still very young children. I will never forget watching a cute, innocuous children's show with my kids when they were little, Dora the Explorer. So it's a nice show, teaches some Spanish vocabulary, and has this sense of adventure and exploration. What's not to love? But there was an episode where there was a wicked witch who would trap people inside of a magic ball. Dora and her friends, they outwitted the witch, and they trapped her inside the ball instead. If this had been a fairy tale, like one of Grimm's fairy tales or Hansel and Gretel, something like that from 100 years ago, 200 years ago, Dora would have dropped this magic ball into a river to drown the witch or maybe set it on fire and killed her. Instead, Dora has a talk with the witch, and she tells the witch, I don't mean you any harm. I don't want to hurt you. If you promise to be good, you can come out of the ball. And the witch, of course, promises she's learned her lesson because Dora was nice to her. And so she comes out and they become great friends. So what is that trying to teach children? It's a corrupted form of the gospel. So the gospel is that Jesus Christ, at the cost of his own life, was broken on the cross so that sinful people could be forgiven and reconciled to him. It cost his blood, his death. And even so, still most people will reject him. And he told us that we're to love our enemies because it will show them what God is like. Even so, some will believe, most will not. What's the gospel according to Dora? People are good. They don't need to be redeemed. They just need somebody to be nice to them. And if we are nice to them, it will cost us nothing, and they will always turn good and be nice to us. No risk, all gain. But loving your neighbor and loving your enemies, that's dangerous in the real world. It can come at a great cost. In Uncle Tom's Cabin, a work of fiction, true, but nevertheless, it cost Tom his life to love the people who were persecuting him. It has cost Christians, though, in real life, their lives thousands and hundreds of thousands of times over throughout the years. In the 1500s in Europe, there was a guy named Dirk Willems. He was a Dutch Christian. He was imprisoned and sentenced to death for his faith. And in the dead of winter, he managed to escape out of the castle where he was imprisoned. And he was chased by one of the guards, and he fled across a frozen moat. Now, Willems had been starving in the castle and had lost a lot of weight and was very thin, and he made it across the ice no problem. But the guard following him fell through the ice. Now, Willems reasoned, this guard, if he dies here, he will go to hell forever because he does not know the Lord. But if I die, I only go to heaven to be with Jesus forever. So he turned back and pulled the guard from the lake. Now, if this was Dora the Explorer, the guard and the king, they all would have become his friends, and they would have been sorry for the bad way they treated him. Instead, they took Willems and they tortured him and they burned him at the stake. Real loving your enemies can come at a great cost. So Paul isn't doing a small thing when he tells slaves here to respect their masters and to work hard for them. And this isn't the only place where Paul says this. It's not a one-off in Scripture. In Ephesians 6:5, he says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Titus 2:9, he says, teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything, to try to please them, not to talk back to them. In Colossians 3:22, he goes even farther. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Peter agrees. He writes, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. You might read these things and not be surprised that some Americans 200 years ago used or tried to use the Bible to defend slavery. You might think, the Bible somehow condones slavery. Paul isn't defending slavery here, though. Not at all. In fact, he writes to the Corinthians about the same issue. He says, were you a slave when you were called? In other words, when you became a believer, were you a slave? Don't let it trouble you. Although, if you can gain your freedom, do so. Paul says that freedom from slavery is a good thing. If a Christian slave can do it, they should. But he does not defend slavery. He writes about people who buy and sell slaves. He places them on par with certain other people. He says, the sexually immoral, those practicing homosexuality, slave traders and liars and perjurers. Very distinguished list of people there. So if slavery is evil and slave traders are bad, why does Paul tell slaves to obey and to treat their masters well? The answer is this. The life of a Christian, whether slave or free, whether rich or poor, is intended to communicate the gospel. We don't just tell the world about salvation in Jesus with our words. We live it with our lives. So what message does the slave communicate when he obeys an earthly master? He says that he places a higher value on the rewards and the comforts of the next world than he does this. He communicates that salvation is not about the here and now and its comforts and its rewards, but freedom from slavery is a good thing, but freedom from sin and death forever in the next world is a far greater good. That's what the slave communicates with his life when he chooses to obey even an unjust master. He says, this world is not where I intend to receive justice and good things. It's in the next. And Paul isn't just telling the slaves to obey in order to have a peaceful society where people get along, where things are calm and quiet and orderly. He says that the name, that the name of God and the doctrine not be blasphemed. He's saying this is not just about having an orderly society. This is so that people don't reject the gospel. When we place earthly benefit, even a very important earthly benefit like freedom, above eternal benefits, It tells the world that the gospel is about getting better things in this world, not about the eternity that God has promised. This is just another version of what we sometimes call the prosperity gospel. Come to Jesus and you'll be rich and healthy and powerful in this world. It is a false gospel. It's one that leads people to see what they can get from God's hand rather than leading them to see him and to know him and enjoy him. Now, Paul also talks about money a lot in this chapter. As we read the parts about money, he is communicating exactly the same message as he did when talking about slavery, the otherworldliness, the next world, eternity-focused character of the gospel message. So when he's talking about money, he tells Timothy, people of corrupt mind who have been robbed of the truth and who think that godliness is a means to financial gain. So he's talking about people who have a bad attitude towards money. But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food, clothing, we'll be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. But you, men of God, flee from all this and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. So Paul addresses here, excuse me again, people who are rich and people who want to be rich. And he starts with people who want to become rich as a result of godliness. This includes people who want to get into the ministry in order to earn money. That's not most people, because most people don't earn a lot in the ministry, but it does include the Joel Osteens of the world, the Benny Hinns, all those people who go out there and instead of preaching the humility and following Christ, they preach, send me money and God will bless you. But it also includes ordinary people who think that following Jesus is going to give them more money or more prestige in the world. There was a time long since removed, but when pretending to be a Christian in American culture and going to church was a good way to make business contacts and to get customers. So the appearance of godliness was a tool to get money. That really isn't the case today. I tell you, it's not always a bad thing when following Jesus becomes unpopular. People today are more likely to go to church because they love Jesus, not because of what they think it will get them or the prestige it will bring them. So Paul says that godliness shouldn't be seen as an avenue to earthly riches. It should be an avenue to contentment. Now that is a great word, contentment. It doesn't depend at all on what we have. We can be content no matter what we have or what we don't have. It means being satisfied with how things are, even if things aren't good. Being satisfied with how things are, even if things aren't good. Paul wrote to the Philippians in, I think it's chapter 3. I didn't write it down. I think it's chapter 3. It's verses 12 and 13. He says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. Whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want, I can do all this through him who gives me strength. That is a good verse to memorize. I've learned, at least that part of it, I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. Now, the beauty of this is it's kind of paradoxical. You might expect contentment with the way things are when things are not okay to result in apathetic people who never try to make things better. It's fine. It's not good, but it's okay. I'm content. But paradoxically, godly contentment creates in people this great desire to alleviate, to lessen the suffering and brokenness in this world, even when Our eyes are firmly fixed on the next world instead. So when we aim too high, as human beings, we try to turn this broken world into an earthly paradise, we always end up turning it into an earthly hell instead. And that makes for one of the greatest kinds of science fiction movies, but it makes for a terrible reality. This is the kind of philosophy or aim that gives us mass graves and countries turned into open air prisons with barbed wire to keep people from escaping. So when we try to create utopia, we end up creating dystopia. But when we have contentment, we make things better than they were. So when we accept that the world will never be paradise, that it will always be broken, but we all commit to making it better in modest ways, we turn the world upside down. This is what Christianity has done in the last 2,000 years. Orphanages, care for the elderly, the entire practice of modern medicine, care for the poor, all of these things were outflows of people whose eyes were fixed on the next world, and it motivated them to try to leave this world better without trying to make it paradise. So when it comes to money, it shouldn't be the driving force of our lives to get rich in this present world. You would think then that believing this, that Christians would be greatly opposed to wealth. Indeed, Paul says, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. The love of money. So you'd think the Christian worldview would be that people should just get rid of their wealth, that in poverty we will find spirituality. That's the kind of attitude that you do see in certain monastic orders, like the Franciscan monks. They give away all their possessions, they take a vow of poverty. But here's the problem. The love of money can lead us into sin. But even if you get rid of all of your possessions, you will still have other temptations to sin, because sin is a result of our sinful nature interacting with the world. We carry that sin with us inside us. It's not necessary to find it in the outside world. It's not necessary to find it in our possessions. So even getting rid of all those things, living in a monastic way, it's not going to keep a person from sinning. It might free you from some distractions and let you focus on spirituality more, but it's not going to protect you from what is inside you. Now, one time Jesus did tell a rich man to sell all his possessions and give them to the poor. He did this, though, not because poverty is somehow better. He did it because the man valued his money more than he valued his God. And he wasn't probably even aware that he placed this value on his money. Jesus forced him to make a choice. And when he did, he chose his money over God. That's the only person that Jesus tells this to. What does Paul tell the rich to do? Does he tell them to get rid of their riches? He says in verse 17, command those who are rich in this present world, what? Not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. So he doesn't say that the rich should get rid of their wealth. That's another kind of spiritual pride. Look at me and this great sacrifice that I've made. No, Paul tells the rich to do good deeds with their wealth and to not trust in their wealth, but to trust in God and work to become wealthy in the world to come through their service to God. So the wealth isn't bad. It's the idolization of wealth that is bad. In the same way, idolization of poverty can become bad too. In the same way that idolization of freedom can become bad. Wealth and freedom both can be good things, but they should never be more important to us than knowing Jesus, trusting in him, being in a relationship with him, and showing him to others. So, all things considered, if I had to choose, if God gave me the choice, I'd rather be free and I'd rather be rich. So long as God in this life is pleased to keep me free, and if he should ever decide to make me rich, I trust that he will provide me with the spiritual resources to not be led astray by them and to walk closely with him. But I would rather be poor and have a close relationship with God than to be rich and trust in myself. I would rather be a slave that points others to Jesus than to be free and only live for my own pleasure. So our attitude should be similar. This world is not a thing to be overly treasured or to be overly despised. It isn't our home. As the song says, we are just passing through. It will never be the paradise that some think they can make it into. So the things that make us love the world less, the hardships, the toils, the losses, those are blessings. But still, the world isn't to be despised. The real sufferings of real people, fellow believers and unbelievers alike, it matters. It matters to God, and it should matter to us. And we ought to spend our time, our talents, and our treasures to alleviate that suffering. So if we're spending ourselves in that way, we are storing for ourselves treasures eternal in the world to come. And that, brothers and sisters, that should be our principal focus, the world to come.